In September 1992, a group of hunters discovered the body of a young man inside a rusting bus 142 in the Alaskan wilderness. And this is his final image. A radiant smile, strangely peaceful amidst the starvation and bone-chilling cold.
Greetings, my friends. I am Leonard. At 55 years old, my boots have wandered across continents, from the humid jungles of the Amazon to the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas. I have witnessed life and death intertwine in the most unforgiving domains of Mother Nature, but the tragedy of Christopher McCandless is the one story that constantly preys on my mind.
That young man had everything society desires, a bright future and an affluent family. But he chose to throw it all away. Chris donated his life savings, burned his identification, and severed all ties to throw himself into a high-stakes game of survival with nature. He carried a pure, burning desire for absolute freedom, yet he walked into the frozen Alaskan expanse without so much as a map or a compass. The boundary between a grand, romantic ideal and a fatal mistake is sometimes separated only by a melting glacier. Today, we are going to flip back through the final pages of his diary to understand what truly happened out there in the last frontier. But before we hit the trail, let this old man know. What city or country are you listening to this story from? Drop your location in the comments below, and please don't forget to hit that subscribe button to journey with me as we uncover the most breathtaking and chilling mysteries of the wild. Grab your warmest coat. Let's begin.
And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button to journey with me as we uncover the most breathtaking and chilling mysteries of the wild. Grab your warmest coat. Let's begin. The Alaskan taiga in early September 1992 is a place of brutal, breathtaking transition. The air bites with the crisp, unforgiving chill of approaching winter, carrying the scent of damp earth and dying flora. Above the winding, turbulent waters of the Sushana River, the sky hangs heavy, a bruised, unbroken gray that promises the season's first hard freeze, while a lonely wind whispers through the trembling, yellowing leaves of the alder thickets. In this vast, indifferent wilderness, human presence is an anomaly. Yet the rumble of all-terrain vehicles tore through the silence as a group of local moose hunters navigated the treacherous, overgrown path of the Stampede Trail. The wilderness demands a certain type of person, and these men were carved from the very landscape they navigated.
Leading the pack was Ken Thompson, the owner of an Anchorage auto body shop. Ken was a sturdy, thick-set man in his early 50s. His face was weathered like old leather, lined from years of squinting into the Alaskan sun and snow. He possessed a practical, no-nonsense demeanor, the kind of man who spoke little but observed much, his heavy steps grounded in the reality of survival. Beside him rode his employee and friend, Gordon Sammel. Gordon was a stark contrast to Ken's stoicism. Lean, agile, and sharp-eyed, Gordon had a restless energy about him. He was a man rough around the edges, fiercely independent, with a wild mop of hair and a personality that chafed at the confines of city life. Rounding out the trio was Ferdy Swanson, a construction worker and a quiet giant of a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, and deeply observant, Ferdy had a gentle patience that belied his massive frame. He was the kind of man who listened to the woods before he stepped into them. Their ATVs chewed through the mud and muskeg, their eyes scanning the brush for the massive antlers of bull moose. But what they found instead, sitting incongruously in a clearing overgrown with fireweed, was a rusted relic of civilization. Fairbanks City Transit System. Bus number 142. The old International Harvester, with its peeling green and white paint, looked like an ancient beast whose bones had been left to bleach in the sun. It had been hauled out there years ago by a road construction crew to serve as a makeshift backcountry shelter, and now it was slowly being swallowed by the taiga. As the hunters approached the clearing, a foul, unmistakable odor drifted on the cold wind. It was the heavy, sweet, sickly stench of decay. It stopped the men in their tracks. The wilderness is full of death, a harvested moose, a fallen wolf. But this smell carried a chilling proximity to the rusted metal doors of the bus. They dismounted their vehicles, the crunch of their boots on the frosted ground echoing loudly in the tense silence. Tied to the antenna of the bus was a makeshift signal, a piece of red cloth fluttering desperately in the wind. But it was what was taped to the bus's rear door that made the blood freeze in their veins. It was an SOS note, written in neat block letters on a page torn from a novel. The note read, "SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless." August? The ink was faded, the plea frozen in time. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Gordon, driven by a grim curiosity, stepped forward. The door was slightly ajar. He didn't pull it open. The smell was too overpowering. Instead, he hoisted himself up to peer through a broken window into the gloomy interior of the bus. Inside, the living quarters were a chaotic testament to a desperate struggle for life. But Gordon's sharp eyes immediately locked onto a blue sleeping bag resting on a makeshift bunk. It was occupied. The shape inside was impossibly small, shrunken, and still. When the Alaska State Troopers eventually arrived via helicopter to recover the scene, they unzipped the sleeping bag to find the tragic end of a young odyssey. The body belonged to Christopher McCandless. In life, Chris had been a striking young man of 24. He was relatively short, but previously athletic and wiry, possessing an intense, burning gaze that hinted at his relentless idealism. He had thick, dark hair and an unkempt beard that framed a face often set in an expression of fierce determination. He was a young man who carried the weight of profound philosophical questions on his shoulders, deeply stubborn, wildly intelligent, and fundamentally uncompromising in his quest for absolute freedom. But the wilderness is a ruthless editor of human ambition. The body they pulled from the bus weighed a mere 67 pounds. Starvation had hollowed his cheeks and stripped the muscle from his bones, leaving behind a fragile, tragic shell. Yet, as the investigators meticulously catalogued the belongings left behind in the rusted bus, a different story emerged from the gloom. Among the scattered artifacts was an empty 10-pound bag of rice, the only staple he had brought into the wild. There was a lightweight Remington .22 caliber rifle, a weapon vastly underpowered for the massive game of the Alaskan interior. And there were books, battered, heavily annotated paperbacks of Leo Tolstoy, Jack London, and Henry David Thoreau. Chris had not just been surviving, he had been seeking a spiritual communion with nature, influenced by the romantic ideals of these literary giants. Most haunting of all was a cheap, disposable camera found among his gear. When the film was developed, it revealed the final days of Alexander Supertramp, the name Chris had adopted on the road. The last self-portrait showed Chris standing outside the bus, waving at the lens with one hand while holding a final, handwritten declaration in the other. His frame was shockingly emaciated, his clothes hanging off him like rags on a scarecrow. His eyes were sunken deep into their sockets. But what struck the world, and what still strikes anyone who looks at that photograph, is his face. Despite the agonizing pain of starvation, despite the cold and the inescapable reality of his impending death, Chris McCandless wore a serene, beautiful smile. It was the smile of a monk who had touched the divine, a man who, in his final, fading moments, felt he had successfully lived his truth, even as that truth demanded the ultimate price. The bus, the frozen river, the rusted rifle, and the serene smile. They all stood as silent witnesses to a journey that began with an unyielding desire to escape the modern world and ended in the deepest, most quiet corner of the Alaskan wild.
The earth has a way of calling to those whose spirits cannot be contained by walls of brick and glass. But before one can run wild, one must first break the chains of expectation. In May of 1990, the humid, oppressive heat of Atlanta, Georgia served as the backdrop for Christopher McCandless's graduation from Emory University.
He had achieved remarkable academic success, graduating with honors, carrying a dual degree in history and anthropology. To the outside observer, he was the gleaming product of the American dream, perfectly positioned to step onto the conveyor belt of law school, a lucrative career, and suburban comfort. But behind his intense, dark-eyed gaze, a profound rebellion was reaching its boiling point. On the day of his graduation, his family gathered to celebrate, presenting a picture of affluent success that Chris had grown to secretly despise. His father, Walt McCandless, was a man who commanded the space he occupied. Walt was a brilliant aerospace engineer, a heavy-set, imposing figure with a neatly trimmed beard and a rigid posture that spoke of a lifetime of authority. He possessed a sharp, calculating mind used to managing complex satellite systems for NASA, and he applied that same managing, autocratic approach to his family. Walt was not a man who accepted defiance easily, and his intense need for control was the very anvil upon which Chris's rebellious spirit had been forged. Beside Walt stood Billy McCandless, Chris's mother. Billy was a petite, fiercely energetic woman with sharp features and a driven personality. As Walt's business partner, she shared his ambition, but her eyes often carried the hidden weariness of navigating a volatile, demanding marriage. She loved her son desperately, yet she fundamentally misunderstood the depth of his existential hunger, believing that tangible success could cure his restlessness. The only family member who truly understood Chris was his younger sister, Karine. Sharing his dark hair and striking, expressive features, Karine was an energetic, highly intelligent young woman. But unlike Chris, she possessed a pragmatic warmth and an easy sociability. She was his closest confidant, the one person who could pierce his armor of intellectual arrogance. Yet even she was unaware of the absolute finality of the plans forming in his mind. During the graduation weekend, Walt and Billy, aiming to reward his academic excellence, offered to buy Chris a new car and pay for his impending law school tuition. The offer, meant with love, was interpreted by Chris as a toxic bribe, a chain forged of gold meant to bind him to a life of materialistic hypocrisy. He angrily rejected the gift, fiercely defending his current vehicle, a battered, pale yellow 1982 Datsun B210. To Chris, the Datsun was more than a machine. It was a loyal, unpretentious companion, a scrappy little survivor that he had maintained himself, and it represented his self-reliance. He told his parents he didn't need a new car, nor did he want their money. The tension at that graduation dinner was the final fraying of the rope that bound him to his family. Shortly after they returned to the East Coast, Chris executed a plan of systematic erasure. He had a bank account containing roughly $24,000, money bequeathed by a family friend meant to fund his legal education. Instead of transferring it or saving it, Chris secretly drafted a check for the entire sum and mailed it to Oxfam America, a charity dedicated to fighting global hunger and poverty. This was not a mere act of charity. It was a definitive, philosophical strike against the wealth and privilege he felt had poisoned his upbringing. By late June, Chris had packed the yellow Datsun with a few meager belongings, left his apartment, and instructed the postal service to hold his mail indefinitely. He did not leave a forwarding address. He did not call his sister. He simply vanished, slipping off the grid like a ghost dissolving into the morning mist, driving west toward the setting sun to seek what he vehemently referred to as truth. The journey out of Atlanta was a physical manifestation of his internal liberation. As the Datsun ate up the miles of asphalt, crossing the Mississippi River and venturing into the vast, arid expanse of the American West, Chris felt the suffocating weight of societal expectations lifting from his shoulders. He was heavily influenced by the writings of Leo Tolstoy, who had famously renounced his wealth to wander among the peasants, and Henry David Thoreau, who preached the gospel of simplicity and civil disobedience. Chris sought a life completely unmediated by money, titles, or obligations. By July of 1990, he found himself navigating the scorching, unforgiving terrain of the Mojave Desert. He drove the Datsun off the paved highway and down a rugged, unmaintained dirt track near Lake Mead in Arizona, an area known as Detrital Wash. The environment here was stark and brutal, characterized by baked earth, scrub brush, and a silence so profound it was almost deafening. It was the perfect place for a man trying to lose himself. But nature is indifferent to the philosophies of men. In August, a sudden, violent desert thunderstorm broke open the sky. The rain did not fall. It plummeted in solid sheets, rapidly turning the dry, baked earth of Detrital Wash into a raging, muddy torrent. A flash flood roared through the basin, catching Chris off guard. He managed to scramble out of the Datsun just in time, but the rushing water engulfed the little yellow car, soaking the engine and destroying the battery. When the waters finally receded, leaving behind a thick, suffocating layer of silt and mud, Chris found his beloved vehicle hopelessly stuck and mechanically dead. For any ordinary traveler, this would have been a disaster requiring a desperate hike for a tow truck and the police. But Chris was no longer an ordinary traveler. He viewed the death of the Datsun not as a tragedy, but as a providential sign, an invitation from the universe to shed the final, lingering trapping of his former life. If he sought help, he would have to answer to the authorities, explain why his registration was expired, and risk alerting his parents to his location. Instead, he methodically stripped the Datsun of its Virginia license plates and concealed the car beneath a makeshift camouflage of branches and scrub. He gathered his remaining physical possessions, packing a heavy backpack with his camping gear, his books, and a meager supply of food. Finally, he pulled out his wallet. Inside was a collection of paper money totaling $123. To Chris, these green slips of paper were the ultimate symbol of the society he despised, the currency of compromise, the chains of obligation. In an act of profound theatrical symbolism, he piled the bills on the desert floor, struck a match, and watched as his last connection to the civilized world curled into black ash and blew away on the hot Mojave wind. As the smoke cleared, Christopher McCandless ceased to exist. In his place stood a penniless, unbound wanderer, a man who had successfully amputated his past. He hoisted his heavy pack onto his shoulders, turned his back on the ruined Datsun, and marched out of Detrital Wash. He was now, completely and irrevocably, Alexander Supertramp. The open road is a master sculptor. It chips away at the superficial layers of a person until only the raw, authentic core remains. For Christopher McCandless, now answering exclusively to the moniker Alexander Supertramp, the journey was not merely about geographical distance, but about geographical salvation.
His travels over the next 2 years were an erratic pendulum swing across the continent, pulling him from the high plains of the Midwest to the scorching subterranean depths of the desert, and eventually into the chaotic, unpoliced waters of Mexico. Along this wandering road, Chris was a paradox, fiercely protective of his solitude, yet exuding an undeniable, magnetic charisma that drew in other lonely souls. In the autumn of 1990, Chris's hitchhiking thumb landed him in the dusty, windswept town of Carthage, South Dakota. Here, the landscape was dominated by towering grain elevators and endless oceans of golden wheat. It was in Carthage that Chris crossed paths with Wayne Westerberg. Wayne was a man forged by the agricultural heartland, a hyperkinetic, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s with a thick, blonde beard and hands heavily calloused from years of mechanical labor.
He possessed a sharp, entrepreneurial mind, operating a grain elevator and a custom combining crew that harvested crops across the plains. Wayne was a true Renaissance man of the Midwest, rough around the edges, occasionally operating on the fringe of the law, but fundamentally generous and deeply perceptive. He possessed a booming laugh and an open-door policy for strays and wanderers. Wayne offered Chris a job at the grain silo, a brutal, lung-choking environment of swirling dust and deafening machinery. To Wayne's astonishment, the skinny, intellectual kid from the East Coast proved to be an absolute workhorse. Chris tackled the grueling physical labor with an almost religious fervor. He never complained about the long hours, the dirt, or the exhaustion. He would tackle the most monotonous, back-breaking tasks, shoveling grain, cleaning out the dead space beneath the elevators with a grim, unwavering determination. Wayne quickly recognized that beneath the grime and the ragged clothes, Chris was possessing of a razor-sharp intellect and a highly educated mind. They spent evenings drinking beer and discussing literature, politics, and philosophy. Wayne offered Chris a sense of stability, a surrogate family, and a standing invitation to stay as long as he needed. However, the tragic conflict of Chris's nature was his absolute refusal to lay down roots. Just as he became indispensable to Wayne, Chris felt the suffocating dread of permanence creeping in. Driven by an extreme adherence to his ideals, he refused the comfort of a long-term home, packed his meager belongings, and returned to the highway, leaving Wayne bewildered but deeply respectful of the young man's unyielding convictions. By the winter of 1990, Chris's restless spirit pushed him southward. Driven by an impulsive desire to reach the ocean, he purchased a second-hand aluminum canoe in Arizona. Without a map, without any formal training, and critically, without the required permits, he decided to paddle down the Colorado River, intending to cross the border into Mexico and navigate to the Gulf of California. It was an act of breathtaking recklessness. He paddled through a maze of irrigation canals, relying on luck and sheer stubbornness. But nature, as it always does, eventually tested his hubris. When Chris finally broke through the tidal flats and entered the open, violent waters of the Sea of Cortez, a sudden, ferocious storm descended. The wind howled like a wounded animal, whipping the ocean into towering, frothing swells. The small, lightweight aluminum canoe was tossed about like a dead leaf. Chris found himself fighting for his life, his muscles screaming as he battled the surging currents that threatened to capsize his vessel and drag him into the crushing depths. The salt water lashed his face, and for the first time, the romantic veneer of the wild was stripped away to reveal its terrifying, indifferent reality. Miraculously, he survived, washing ashore exhausted and humbled. He abandoned the canoe in the Mexican brush, a silent monument to his near-death experience, and spent the next several weeks wandering the harsh, desolate coastal desert before slipping back across the U.S. border. Months later, heavily weathered and still relentlessly moving, Chris arrived in the arid, sun-blasted landscape near the Salton Sea in Southern California. It was here, amidst the nomadic communities of drifters and outcasts, that he met Ronald Franz in early 1992. Ron Franz was an 80-year-old retired Army veteran and a devoutly religious man. Physically, Franz was a towering figure, his broad, formidable frame slightly stooped by age, with a shock of white hair and thick-lensed glasses that magnified a gaze full of profound, enduring sorrow. Decades earlier, Franz had lost his beloved wife and his only son in a tragic automobile accident. The devastating loss had driven him to alcohol, a demon he had fought and conquered, channeling his lingering grief into his faith and a quiet, solitary life dedicated to adopting and mentoring Okinawan orphans. Yet, his heart remained achingly lonely. When Franz picked up the young hitchhiker, an immediate, powerful bond formed. To Franz, Chris was the phantom of the son he had lost. To Chris, Franz was the kind of patient, non-judgmental father figure he had always craved. Franz took Chris under his wing, inviting the boy into his meticulously kept apartment, teaching him the intricate, patient art of leathercraft. Under Franz's gentle guidance, Chris crafted a beautiful heavy leather belt meticulously carving the pictorial story of his wanderings into the hide. The word Alex, the initials CJM, a skull and crossbones, and the winding roads he had traveled. But Chris's ideology remained a sharp, uncompromising blade. He saw Franz's comfortable, static life not as a sanctuary, but as a tragic waste of human potential. In a series of intense, passionate conversations, Chris implored the 80-year-old man to abandon his home, to sell his possessions, and to embrace the unpredictable beauty of a nomadic existence. He argued that the human spirit was fed by new experiences, not by the safety of routine. The conflict between Chris's radical youthful idealism and Franz's deep-seated need for connection reached its inevitable breaking point when Chris announced it was time for him to leave for his ultimate destination: Alaska. Franz was heartbroken. He pleaded with Chris to stay, even asking to formally adopt the 24-year-old as his legal grandson. Chris, terrified of the emotional intimacy and the implicit obligation of such an offer, gently but firmly refused. He promised to return after his Alaskan adventure, shouldering his backpack and walking out of Franz's life. The departure left Franz entirely shattered. He took Chris's radical advice, placed his belongings in storage, and moved out into the desert, waiting for the boy's return. When the news eventually reached him months later that Chris had starved to death in a rusted bus in the Alaskan taiga, the grief was absolute. The tragedy broke the old man's spirit so completely that he publicly renounced his faith in God, devastated that a benevolent creator could allow such a bright, beautiful light to be extinguished while leaving an old man to suffer the darkness alone.
The architecture of a person's ruin is rarely built overnight. It is constructed brick by brick over years of silent resentment. Before Christopher McCandless sought the raw, unfiltered truth of the Alaskan taiga, he lived in the manicured, profoundly filtered world of Annandale, Virginia. It was a landscape of affluence, characterized by sweeping green lawns, luxury vehicles, and the unspoken societal agreements of upper-middle-class America. At the center of this world was his father, Walt McCandless. To the outside observer, Walt was a towering figure of success. As an eminent aerospace engineer who had done pioneering work for NASA and later established his own highly successful consulting firm, Walt was a man whose intellect was as formidable as his presence. He was thick-set and commanding, possessing a mind that could untangle the most complex satellite telemetry, yet he wielded his authority at home with a heavy, uncompromising hand. He was a man who demanded excellence and expected unquestioning compliance. But beneath the polished veneer of his professional triumphs lay a fractured, deeply concealed domestic history.
The catalyst for Chris's ultimate detachment did not occur on a mountain peak, but during a solitary road trip he took to Southern California in the summer of 1986, shortly after graduating from high school. Driven by a lingering curiosity about his roots, Chris visited the neighborhood in El Segundo, where he had spent his earliest years. There, piecing together offhand comments from old family friends and neighbors, he unearthed a secret that had been carefully buried beneath years of suburban respectability. He discovered the existence of a parallel life. Before Walt had met Chris's mother, Billy, he had been married to a woman named Marcia. Marcia was a woman whose youthful brightness had been slowly eroded by the turbulent, domineering nature of her marriage to Walt. She was tall, with a weary elegance and a sharp memory. A woman who had tried to build a stable foundation only to find the ground constantly shifting beneath her. Walt and Marcia had children together, but their marriage was deeply fractured. The devastating revelation for Chris was not simply that his father had been married before. He knew about his half-siblings. The soul-crushing discovery was the timeline. Chris learned that Walt's relationship with Marcia had not ended when he moved in with Billy and fathered Chris. For years, Walt had maintained a double life. He had continued to secretly visit Marcia, and he had even fathered another son with her, Chris's half-brother Quinn, 2 years after Chris was born. For a young man who viewed the world through an intensely polarized lens of absolute right and absolute wrong, this discovery was apocalyptic. Chris did not see human frailty or the complex, messy failures of adult relationships. He saw a calculated, monstrous deception. He viewed his father's actions as a profound, moral crime. It meant that the very foundation of his childhood, the idyllic family portrait presented to the world in Annandale, was an elaborate, filthy lie. It meant that he, his mother, and his sister, Karine, had been participants in a tragic farce orchestrated by a man who demanded moral perfection from his children while living in profound hypocrisy himself. Rather than confronting his parents with this explosive knowledge, Chris internalized the trauma. He packed the secret deep within his chest, where it festered and hardened into a cold, impenetrable wall of resentment. Over his college years, this internal rot fundamentally altered his personality. The charismatic, highly social young man began to retreat into a dark, brooding intellectualism. He began to view not just his father, but the entire structure of the society his father represented as fundamentally corrupt. It was in this state of deep spiritual alienation that Chris found his gospel in the pages of Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Thoreau's philosophy resonated with the frequency of Chris's pain. Thoreau preached the necessity of stripping away the artificial layers of civilized life to confront the essential facts of existence. He argued that wealth and material possessions were not markers of success, but heavy, suffocating chains that distracted the soul from the pursuit of genuine truth. For Chris, reading Thoreau was not merely an academic exercise, it was a blueprint for salvation. If his father's world of luxury and status was built on a foundation of lies, then the only way to cleanse himself was to embrace absolute, ascetic poverty. This philosophical awakening reframed his entire relationship with the physical world. The sprawling family mansion in Virginia, with its plush carpets and expensive art, became a monument to hypocrisy in his eyes. Every dollar his parents earned, every luxury they enjoyed, felt tainted by the original sin of his father's deception. This is the crucial context that illuminates his violent rejection of his parents' graduation gifts. When Walt and Billy offered to buy him a new car to replace his battered Datsun, and when they offered to pay for his law school tuition, Chris did not see an act of parental love. He saw an attempt to buy his complicity. He saw it as hush money. To accept the car would be to accept a place in Walt's fraudulent kingdom. To drive a shiny new vehicle purchased with his father's wealth would be to compromise the pristine moral purity he was desperately trying to cultivate. His obsession with minimalism became a shield against the pain of his past. By divesting himself of money, by reducing his possessions to what he could carry on his back, and by ultimately abandoning his own name, Chris was attempting a radical psychological amputation. He was cutting away the infected tissue of his family history. He sought the wilderness because the wild does not lie. A mountain does not deceive you. A river does not live a double life. In the brutal, unforgiving reality of nature, Chris believed he could finally find an environment that operated on pure, honest consequence, free from the toxic shadows of his father's sins. The road to Alaska, therefore, was paved long before he ever set foot on the Stampede Trail. It was paved in the quiet, suffocating hallways of his childhood home.
The Great Land, as the native peoples have long called Alaska, does not care about the human heart. It does not care about your anger, your ideals, or your quest for spiritual purity. In April of 1992, Christopher McCandless finally reached the threshold of his ultimate dream, standing on the snow-packed shoulder of the George Parks Highway, thumbing a ride into the frozen unknown. He was picked up by a man named Jim Gallion, who would hold the heavy distinction of being the last human being to ever see Alexander Supertramp alive.
Jim Gallion was a union electrician and a lifelong Alaskan, a man who understood the brutal arithmetic of the northern bush. Physically, Gallion was a formidable, rugged figure in his early 40s, possessing the thick, sturdy build of a man who worked with his hands and hauled heavy game through the snow. He had a weather-beaten face, sharp, observant eyes, and a deeply pragmatic personality.
Galleon did not suffer fools gladly, yet beneath his tough exterior lay a profound, inherent decency and a protective instinct toward those who underestimated the wild. As Chris climbed into the cab of Galleon's four-wheel drive truck, the experienced hunter immediately assessed the young man's gear and felt a cold knot of alarm tighten in his stomach.
Chris excitedly declared his plan to walk deep into the wilderness north of Mount McKinley to live off the land for months, but his equipment was terrifyingly inadequate for the reality of the Alaskan interior. He carried a 10-pound bag of rice, a cheap nylon tent, and a lightweight Remington .22 caliber rifle, a gun suitable for shooting rabbits and squirrels, but dangerously underpowered for bringing down a bear or a moose. Worst of all, Chris had no compass, no axe, no bug gear, and his map was nothing more than a ragged, inadequate tear-out from a gas station atlas. His footwear consisted of cheap, lightweight hiking boots that were completely useless against the freezing muck and deep snow of the taiga. Galleon, deeply troubled by the boy's ignorance, spent the 2-hour drive trying to talk him out of the suicide mission. He warned Chris about the lack of game, the impenetrable brush, and the lethal cold, even offering to drive him all the way to Anchorage to buy him proper gear. But Chris was impervious to reason. He was riding a high wave of absolute conviction, politely but firmly deflecting every piece of practical advice. He wanted to rely strictly on his own wits, viewing any technological or external assistance as a corruption of his pure wilderness experience. Realizing he could not stop the stubborn young man, Galleon insisted that Chris at least take a pair of heavy rubber work boots, popularly known in Alaska as extra toughs, that he had in the back of the truck, along with his own lunch of 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and a bag of corn chips. Chris accepted the boots and the food, but in a final dramatic gesture of severing his ties to civilization, he left behind his watch, his comb, and all his remaining loose change on the dashboard of Galleon's truck. On Tuesday, April 28, 1992, Jim Galleon watched the young man disappear down the snow-covered Stampede Trail, a small, fragile figure swallowed by the vast white expanse. For the first few weeks, the wild seemed to bend to Chris's romantic ideals. The spring temperatures were forgiving enough, and because the summer thaw had not yet arrived, he was able to easily cross the Teclanica River, which was running low and sluggish beneath its icy banks. Just 20 miles down the trail, he stumbled upon an unimaginable stroke of luck. Fairbanks City Transit System bus, number 142. Outfitted with a wood stove and a makeshift bunk, the abandoned vehicle was a rusted sanctuary amidst the harsh landscape. Chris dubbed it the Magic Bus, treating it as his base camp, his fortress of solitude, and his personal Walden Pond. He spent his days exploring the surrounding taiga, reading his beloved paperbacks, writing triumphant entries in his journal, and surviving by shooting small game, porcupines, ptarmigans, and squirrels. He felt a soaring sense of emotional victory. He had done it. He had successfully detached from the toxic, materialistic world of his parents and was sustaining himself purely by the grace of the earth. But the boreal forest is a place of feast or famine, and the small game alone was not enough to sustain the caloric demands of a young man chopping wood and hiking daily. His body began to slowly consume its own fat reserves. Then, in early June, the ultimate test and the ultimate tragedy presented itself. Stalking through the dense brush, Chris encountered a moose. It was a massive, towering creature of the taiga, weighing close to 1,000 pounds, with a thick, dark brown coat and a hulking silhouette that moved with deceptive grace through the trees. Armed only with his lightweight .22 caliber rifle, Chris managed to shoot the massive beast, bringing it down in a feat of extraordinary luck and desperate marksmanship. When he wrote in his diary on June 9th, the entry was ecstatic, a record of the greatest physical achievement of his life. He had secured hundreds of pounds of meat. He had conquered the wild. But this emotional victory was a terrifying illusion. The triumph of the kill was immediately overshadowed by the gruesome, monumental reality of the butchering process. Chris was a suburban kid with no foundational knowledge of how to preserve large game in the rapidly warming Alaskan summer. In the deep wilderness, an animal must be quickly bled, meticulously sliced, and carefully smoked or dried to prevent spoiling. Chris tried to follow the advice he had read in books, attempting to smoke the meat over a makeshift fire, but his efforts were clumsy and entirely ineffective. Within days, the Alaskan warmth transformed his grand prize into a nightmare. Swarms of flies descended upon the carcass, laying millions of eggs that rapidly hatched into a writhing, putrid sea of maggots. The smell of decay became an overwhelming, suffocating presence around the magic bus. Despite his frantic efforts, the meat rotted away, becoming completely inedible. He had to drag the remains far from the camp to escape the stench and the predators it might attract. This catastrophic failure broke something fundamental inside Chris. For the first time, the romantic veil of the wilderness was violently ripped away. He was forced to confront the harsh, unsentimental reality that nature does not reward good intentions or philosophical purity. It only rewards competence. In his journal, the triumphant tone vanished, replaced by a dark, crushing despair. He realized that he had taken a life for absolutely nothing, squandering a magnificent creature through his own arrogant ignorance. The rotting moose became a profound psychological turning point, plunging him into a severe depression. It was the moment Alexander Supertramp realized that he was not a master of the wild, but a vulnerable, isolated boy trapped in an unforgiving machine of life and death, and that his grand Alaskan adventure had suddenly transformed into a desperate, ticking clock for survival. By the beginning of July 1992, the psychological landscape of Christopher McCandless had shifted as dramatically as the melting snows of the Alaskan taiga. The crushing failure of the rotting moose had stripped away the last of his romantic arrogance. He had spent 2 months entirely alone, surviving on meager rations of small game and foraged flora, reading his beloved Tolstoy, and listening to the profound, terrifying silence of the boreal forest.
Through this intense isolation, the anger that had driven him away from society began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning realization. He'd proven to himself that he could survive the harshness of the wild, but in doing so, he recognized that the wild was a lonely place to exist permanently. He was ready to forgive. He was ready to return. On July 3rd, he packed his backpack, closed the door of the magic bus, and began the 20-mile trek back to the George Parks Highway. However, the Stampede Trail in July is a fundamentally different beast than the trail in April. When Chris first crossed the Teklanika River, it had been a sluggish, knee-deep stream of icy water, its flow choked by the lingering winter freeze. But as he approached the riverbanks on July 5th, he was met with a terrifying sight. The summer heat and the melting glaciers of the Alaska Range had transformed the Teklanika into a monstrous, roaring torrent of opaque, gray-white water. It was a 60-foot-wide barrier of churning violence, carrying debris and jagged ice at a lethal velocity. Chris, who had always possessed a deep-seated fear of water stemming from his near-death experience in a canoe off the coast of Mexico, assessed the raging river. He was a weak swimmer, and stepping into that glacial runoff would mean instant, freezing death.
Tragically, Chris lacked a detailed topographical map. Had he possessed one, he would have seen that just half a mile downstream, the river narrowed into a canyon where a USGS gauging station spanned the water, complete with an aluminum basket suspended on a steel cable. A safe passage across the impassable barrier. Blind to his salvation, and deeply intimidated by the roaring waters, Chris made a fatal decision. He turned around. He retreated back into the bush, heading towards the familiar shelter of Bus 142, assuming he could simply wait until August when the temperatures dropped and the river receded. He did not know that he had just sealed his own fate. Back at the bus, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. The small game that had sustained him in the spring seemingly vanished into the dense summer brush. As his caloric intake plummeted, Chris was forced to rely heavily on foraging to survive. He began gathering large quantities of wild potato roots, known scientifically as Hedysarum alpinum. These roots were safe and nutritious, but as the summer progressed, they became tough and inedible. To compensate, Chris began harvesting the plant's seeds. This seemingly minor shift in his diet was the invisible trigger of his demise. The author and investigator, John Krakauer, spent years meticulously researching this exact phase of Chris's life, eventually forming a compelling, tragic hypothesis. Krakauer posited that the seeds of the wild potato plant Chris consumed were heavily infected with a toxic mold, specifically a fungus that produces an alkaloid known as swainsonine, or an amino acid that disrupts metabolic processes. The insidious nature of this toxin is that it does not kill immediately. Rather, it fundamentally destroys the body's ability to convert food into usable energy. Once the toxin built up in his system, Chris could eat, but he would starve on a cellular level. His body, completely depleted of fat reserves, began rapidly consuming its own muscle tissue. The young man who had once hiked across deserts and shoveled grain for 12 hours a day was reduced to a state of crippling, agonizing weakness. By early August, he could barely stand, let alone hunt or gather wood. Realizing the grim reality of his condition, Chris gathered his remaining strength to write a desperate SOS note, taping it to the door of the bus in the futile hope that a passing hunter might find him. He then retreated into the rusted shell of the vehicle, slipping into the blue sleeping bag his mother had sewn for him years ago. As his body failed him, his mind achieved a heartbreaking clarity. In his final days, Chris read Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. He read deeply about the nature of love, purpose, and community. Next to a passage describing the necessity of sharing joy with others, the fiercely independent Alexander Supertramp, the boy who had run away from every human connection, picked up his pen. In the margins, he wrote his final, defining revelation: happiness only real when shared. It was the ultimate emotional victory, a profound spiritual awakening, but it arrived at the exact moment his physical body crossed the point of no return. On August 18th, day 113 of his Alaskan exile, Chris McCandless took his final photograph. He held a brief, handwritten farewell note, his face emaciated beyond recognition, yet his eyes were bright, and his lips held a serene, beautiful smile. Shortly after he closed his eyes and drifted away, his spirit finally released into the vast, indifferent Alaskan sky. The story, however, does not end with his last breath. 10 months after Chris's body was recovered by the moose hunters, a helicopter thundered over the taiga, touching down in the clearing near the Stampede Trail. From the aircraft stepped Walt and Billy McCandless. The tragedy had fundamentally altered them. Walt, once a commanding, imposing figure of authority, was now a humbled man. His broad shoulders slumped under the unbearable weight of a father's grief. His sharp eyes softened by endless tears. Billy, the petite, fiercely driven woman, appeared fragile, her face pale and drawn, clutching a bouquet of fireweed and spruce branches. Accompanying them was their pilot, a rugged, quiet Alaskan veteran with a respectful, solemn demeanor, giving the grieving parents the space they needed. Billy stepped into the rusted interior of Bus 142. It no longer smelled of decay. The harsh winter had scrubbed it clean, leaving only the scent of dust and memory. With the meticulous, loving care of a mother, she spent hours cleaning the space, arranging her son's boots, and organizing the makeshift living quarters. Beneath the bed where Chris had died, she placed a heavy metal suitcase. Inside was a comprehensive emergency survival kit, blankets, high-calorie food, a first aid kit, and a note urging any future traveler to call their parents as soon as possible. Outside, Walt drilled into the metal frame of the bus, firmly attaching a brass memorial plaque honoring their brilliant, complicated, and tragically lost son. As they boarded the helicopter to leave the great land forever, they looked down at the tiny green and white speck of the bus, finally understanding the profound depth of his ideals and mourning the terrible price he paid to find them.
Welcome back to the fire, my friends. As the embers fade, let us reflect on the final lesson Christopher McCandless left behind. His last written words were, "Happiness only real when shared." After stripping away everything, his money, his comfort, and even his name, he realized that a life without human connection is profoundly empty. In our busy daily lives, it is so easy to feel overwhelmed. We often dream of running away from our jobs, our responsibilities, and our routines to find some quiet forest of our own. But his journey gently reminds us that while solitude can heal, it is the people we love, our family, our friends, and even kind strangers, who give our lives true warmth and meaning. We do not need to walk into the Alaskan wilderness to find our truth. We can find it right here, across a dinner table or in a simple conversation with someone we care about.
May God bless every single one of you watching this today. May He guide your steps, keep you safe on your own personal journeys, and surround you with people who share your joy.
If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone you love, and leave a comment below. I invite you to type Amen in the comments to honor his final realization and to celebrate the beautiful connections that bind us all together. Thank you for walking this trail with me.